Hi, hello everyone. Professor Henri Levy, is it? Hi. Good to see you. First of all, I would like to say, Professor Bernard-Henri Levy, friends, colleagues, it was such an honor to be part of this conference, and I would like to first start by thanking the organizers of this conference. It was such a wonderful and thought-provoking exchange of ideas. So I was asked to talk about the excellent work of Professor Levy that served really as a formative moment for all of us, and also to share its connection to the work that I myself was compelled to lead and the actions that emerged from this crisis. Perhaps also the powers we found within ourselves to respond to the reality around us, and I truly appreciate that opportunity. Sorry. There are moments in history when history confronts us not only with atrocity, but with a crisis of perception, a crisis of truth. October 7 was one of those moments. For nearly 3 years, I have often asked myself, For nearly 3 years, I was often asked, what was the greatest challenge in documenting the crimes committed that day? People assume the answer is obvious: the brutality, the scale, the trauma. Much of it was indeed the trauma that accompanied, the documentation of these crimes. But the fundamental challenge that sent us to this journey was documenting crimes that so many violently denied. The instability of the truth emerged in an instant, not years later, but almost simultaneously. The events and their erosion unfolded together. One of the questions that has accompanied me since October 7th is not only how would we as a society or the institutions around us would respond to the mass atrocities, but how would they respond when the atrocity itself immediately became contested? As a legal scholar, I expected solidarity, compassion, perhaps debates over responsibility, responses to trauma, accountability, victims' rights. What I did not anticipate was the struggle over whether the violence itself could be established as a fact, and specifically the sexual violence. Within days, there was already a battle over the truth, over victims' and survivors' testimonies, evidence, and the credibility of films that were taken by the terrorists themselves, in which they glorified their violence. It was only later, reading Professor Bernard-Henri Levy's remarkable book, that I realized he had given language to what so many of us had experienced. As Bernard so eloquently argued, the massacre itself was immediately accompanied by another event: its dismantling, its repression, its transformation into doubt, into hatred, an attempt to make the weight of October 7th events be forgotten. This leads us to the understanding that anti-Semitism does not only operate at the level of hostility, it operates at a level of perception. It introduces a kind of instability, not only around Jews or concerning Jews, but around truth itself. It affects the conditions under which knowledge is produced, circulated, and believed. It introduces what can be said, what can be accepted as credible, what cannot be believed, whose victimhood is accepted or denied, which narratives are preserved. This realization guided us. And I want to say that once instability about the truth enters, everything becomes harder to hold. For all of us, the burden quietly shifted from those who denied to those who must now prove. For those of us working on gender issues and sexual crimes, it became clear that we weren't operating in a sympathetic evidentiary environment, or even a neutral one. We experienced hesitation, denial, sometimes by respected institutions, professionals, and scholars. Denial that over time became more and more sophisticated. It served a role in fueling anti-Semitism worldwide. We were witnessing the sexual atrocities, bearing the trauma that at times really made us physically ill, while simultaneously confronting very organized efforts to question, to relativize, or politicize the evidence itself. I remember myself asking at the UN, is there international law for Israeli women? Is it going to protect us? Thinking to myself, are we even human? Can't they express minimal solidarity? Can't they call for the release of the hostages without hesitation? That experience has led me to think differently about the relationship between legal documentation and anti-Semitism. I increasingly see anti-Semitism not as a form of hostility, as I said, directed towards Jews, but as something that operates epistemically. This became particularly visible, as I said, on the sexual violence. Victims of sexual violence are extremely vulnerable. Witnesses of sexual trauma as well. The truth about this violence is fragile, fragmented. As someone whose academic work has been grounded in feminist theory, I entered this work with a deep commitment to principles that have shaped feminist jurisprudence for decades, feminist activism for decades. The testimony of sexual victims of sexual violence deserve careful attention. The trauma affects the way victims speak. The documentation is essential for accountability, that victims are believed, recognized. Yet after October 7, I found that these assumptions did not operate consistently, that evidentiary thresholds appeared to shift. Basic compassion, as I said, was absent. The moment you tell a victim, a nation, a people, I know you've been through hell, really the softest mechanisms have failed. As Professor Henri Levy writes, the truth is that the pogrom should have been, and indeed for a brief moment was, an opportunity for absolute solidarity with the dead and with those who mourn them. But it produced quite the opposite result, a surge of anti-Semitism, or to call it by its proper name, an unprecedented wave of hatred towards Jews, the likes of which had not been seen since the Second World War, a wave that has since grown into a storm. That observation became the landscape in which we worked. We believed that evidence would create consensus. Levy calls it the erasure of events, highlighting that evidence did not end. That the violence did not end. It continued through the distortion, through skepticism, through the transformation of documented facts into political work. Jewish victims often encounter demands of levels of corroboration that would rarely be expected elsewhere in the world. The question was no longer simply whether sufficient evidence existed, but whether Jewish and Israeli-based testimony could acquire legitimacy in the first place. From the outset, we understood that documentation itself had become part of the intervention, part of justice, part of combating anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic narratives. The result was not simply a historical archive or a legal report. It was really an attempt to stabilize the factual record under conditions in which the record itself was under attack. After months of documentation and immersing ourselves in the depth of human suffering, in testimonies, in visuals, we were able to put the most comprehensive legal foundation for the crimes. I wanted to say here today to all of you that we established a secure archive that really preserved all the information on these crimes. And also, once the report was released, Silence No More, it shifted the global conversation from whether these crimes happened to what are their consequences. Finally, we could confront what these crimes meant. This experience also revealed another limitation that Henri Levy addresses. The crimes themselves exceeded the vocabulary and the scope of imagination through which civilized societies understand evil. Professor Levy writes, these events are so distant from our ordinary ways of seeing that we fail to recognize them as depicting reality. They are so alien to the way our understanding is organized that we continue to think what is written before us or what is brought before us cannot be true. Accordingly, these events provoke in us a strange form of disbelief. We continue to insist that they cannot be real. This describes exactly what we encountered. While documenting the sexual crimes, we felt we lacked the language to describe these crimes. We saw people believe that this is beyond comprehension. The problem was not lack of evidence, it was really that existing legal vocabulary was often insufficient to describe what we were documenting. Again and again, survivors' experiences exceeded existing legal categories. Reality itself appeared impossible. Our task, therefore, was to reconstruct the conditions under which truth could once again become visible. That realization led us to develop concepts such as kinocide, kin as in familial relations, kinocide and kinocidal sexual violence, the systematic torture of families. As a unique form of evil, it wasn't to create new terminology for its own sake, but because legal language shapes legal recognition. While working with victims worldwide, hearing their stories, sharing our experiences of documentation, we found that it gives language to the victims to describe what they have been through. I often say that Hamas allowed us a window to hell. When law lacks concepts, certain harms remain difficult to articulate, analyze, and ultimately address. For me, this has broader implication for the study of anti-Semitism. So if anti-Semitism can operate by undermining the credibility of Jewish testimony and destabilizing the production of knowledge, then documentation, as I said, is not merely a technical legal exercise, it's become an epistemic practice, a historical act. So to conclude, in many ways, our parallel efforts, parallel journeys, Bernard Levy's book and our documentation efforts are a theoretical intervention in a complex reality. They are founded on the realization that anti-Semitism has an epistemic dimension, and in that realm, philosophical theorization and legal documentation function as a form of epistemic resistance. In our case, feminist resistance, humanistic resistance. Thank you.